So if the scientific community is so certain, why is the public not? Well, some of it has to do with where they get information. So here in 2009, this particular Research America poll asked Americans to name a living scientist, and 2/3 couldn't. And if you notice, the third who did, they're all dead. Stephen Hawking just died last year. This poll was done, he was still alive then. And none of those people on the right side are climate scientists. So people are not going to get information about climate from a scientist, at least not very likely. So where are they going to get this information? Probably through us, through members of the media. So I was part of this research project with some colleagues at Yale and George Mason. How often do you watch or listen to the following shows? Local TV news, sometimes or often. So it's one of the things I've said to you over and over and over. 2/3 of Americans still say local TV news is their go-to place for news and information. And what do people want? Weather. Weather is the primary thing that people tune into in a local news station. On a day like today, I can guarantee it. Okay? And in this market, I've shown you clips from KXAN, which is the #1 station in town. I mentioned Chad Cross is the news director there. He's one of my former students. He's in my first class here in 1999 to 2000. We watched Shannon Wolfson last week anchor from that station. The executive producers are graduate of this program, one of the assignment desk manager. But the chief weathercaster there is #1, and he's been here 30 years. His name is Jim Spencer. And all of the stations know that on a day like today, when this weather happens, if somebody's watching Days of Our Lives on ABC, and there's a little scroll in the bottom that says severe thunderstorm warning, the dials turn to Jim Spencer. Because he's been here 30 years. And people trust him. And on a day like today, you want to know what's happening. It turns out weather's the most important reason people watch news. And what's really handy about this research is they're the second most trusted source of climate change information after scientists. Yeah, this poll's a little old. So this was done during Barack Obama's presidency. So if it were repeated now, Donald Trump would probably be in there. But scientists are the primary source of information, but we just found out the public doesn't know how to go to scientists. But they do know their local weathercasters, and often have an intimate relationship with their local weathercasters. We've talked a little bit about this, how when you're an anchor and you come into people's homes, people feel like they really know you. So let's talk then about this article that you read. And the title, this was way before Donald Trump became president, okay? Yeah, the term trumps, remember in a card game, how a card can trump? This article was written in 2012, okay? So this is before that happened, right? So just some quick facts about it. I know you read it, I hope you read it, and we're going to dissect it a little bit. So this is about, next spring I'm going to teach the reporting in the environment class, and a couple of you stopped by today to talk about it. It's one of my favorite classes, and one of the things we do is we dissect how studies are done in order to be able to report on them. So I want to tell you a little bit about methodology. So it was an online survey, and we got 52% of TV weathercasters to respond. Is that good? Is that a good rate for survey research? Yes, it's very good. So we got half of all working television weathercasters to respond, which is really good. It means we can feel confident that what we found is going to be applicable to the largest possible segment of the population. So don't worry about all these facts again. So we found out that only 6% work at stations with a full-time science or environment reporter, and I guarantee you that number has gone down. What does that mean? If there's somebody not at the station who can cover science and environment, it means the weathercaster is going to cover it. So one of the questions we asked them are you comfortable with this initiative to make you more than the weathercaster and make you the go-to science expert at the station? And 4 out of 5 said yeah. And in talking to weathercasters, they've covered everything from astronomy to zoology. What do they have to do with meteorology? One of them told me that in California said whenever an earthquake happens, they come and ask me about plate tectonics. Well, meteorology and plate tectonics are not really very similar, but oftentimes the weathercaster is the only person in a newsroom with a science background. 87% in this survey said they've already reported on climate change, and I can tell you again now, 100% of them have. All weathercasters now are talking about it. So that's a difference between when this research was published. And this is among the ways in which they talk about it. The most common is in community speaking events. Some weathercasters that I work with make 100 to 200 community speaking events a year on top of being the anchor in the evening news. And one of the most common places is school visits. Has anyone had a weathercaster come to your school and visit? Romy, what did they come talk about? Do you remember?
I think earthquakes.
Earthquakes. Where was that?
In California.
In California. Who else had a hand up?
In elementary school, I think they came and talked about, I think it was some sort of like natural event. Like I think it was either hurricanes or
Yeah.
earthquakes or something.
Yeah, so they come and talk about the weather, and oftentimes this is where they talk about climate change too. In this particular sample, they felt a little more comfortable talking about it when they go out to schools and things rather than talking about it on the air. A lot of the weathercasters, if they mention it on the air, immediately they get slammed on social media, liberal media, and Jim Spencer I was just talking about now has a blog around this, where when he talks about, all he does sometimes is report, this is now the warmest month the Earth has ever had now for the 127th month, and then he gets dinged for it, saying, you're taking an agenda. No, I'm actually just reporting a fact. So they talk about climate change in a variety of ways. And in this particular sample, a quarter of them said they'd like to report on it more. Some new research has been done built off this, and that number's over 50%. So almost all weathercasters want to talk about it more. This all sounds like great news, right? They're the second most trusted source of information. They have access to the public. People trust them. They're trained in science. So what's the problem? Well, let's look at a couple of questions and see where we had some problems. Which of the following comes closest to your own view? Most scientists think global warming is happening. A third said yes. Only 3% thought it wasn't happening. I guess that's positive. 2/3 of this sample of weathercasters thought there was a lot of disagreement among scientists. Didn't we just see 97 to 98% of scientists agree? These weathercasters are trained in science. What's happening? Well, the key is in the title, right? About ideology. Oh my God, look at that chart. When you saw that chart, did your eyes glaze over? Yeah, you could be honest with me, right? Right. As journalists, sometimes this much data can feel really overwhelming. So I want to spend about 5 minutes on this chart because I want to make you feel more comfortable being able to look at data, because journalists, especially science and environmental reporters, are going to see a lot of data like this and have to be able to ask some good questions about it. So the table tells us it's a multiple regression analysis. That just hurts your ears, right? Wow. Predicting trust among 11 climate change sources. So the idea here is try to figure out what it is that impacts weathercasters' trust in sources of information. Where I want to start is down here at the bottom. Do you see these p-values? I know you've seen these before, right? Biology classes and things. Let's start with 1 asterisk, p less than 0.05. Somebody tell me what that means.
If the
Ty.
p-value is less than 0.05, then it could be considered like scientifically accurate.
Yeah, it's referred to as statistical significance. So it kind of goes back again to 95%. If p is less than 0.05, we go back to that very likely statement. Scientists can say there's the 95% chance that what we're reporting in this data is real to the larger community of weathercasters. So 1 asterisk, 95% probabilities. So then we go to 2 asterisks, p less than 0.01. Tell me, interpret that for me. We went from 95 to what? 99. So is that more statistically significant? Yes. So 2 asterisks. Finally, 3 asterisks, 0.001. 99.9. That is a really high level of confidence in data. So what we're looking for when we look through this chart is where we see 3 asterisks especially, right? Because that means that we're more comfortable knowing that what we found in our data can be applied to the larger population of weathercasters. Remember when we talked about science, there's never 100%? You just can't. But 99.9, that's good, right? We can feel pretty confident. So let's work our way through the other variables now. So it's a 3-step regression. In the first step, we're looking at how gender and age might affect trust among weathercasters in these sources. So which ones stand out? This one here. So with 3 asterisks in gender, and another one here. So if anybody remembers reading this, do you remember what this says? It says that women are more trusting of the IPCC report than men. So this big report that we've been referenced, women weathercasters were more trusting in it at a statistically significant level. You know what's interesting about that is it coincides with a lot of other research that shows that women in general are more trusting of sources, especially official sources. That actually means good things about this data because it lines up with some other data, all right? But there's not a lot of other factors happening with gender and age. So gender and age aren't predicting skepticism in these sources. Step 2, these seals of approval. Have you ever seen these on your local weathercaster when they do the news? So tonight, if you get home in time before the deluge happens, watch the local news and you'll see next to their name, there'll be this seal of approval right next to them. And it may say AMS, American Meteorological Seal of Approval, CBM, Certified Broadcast Meteorologist, or National Weather Association. And among weathercasters, it's a really big deal, but the audience doesn't really care. Most of you probably never even seen it, right? But what it measures is extra education that the weathercasters have received. So presumably, the more educated they are, more trusting or less skeptical they might be. Do we see much happening here in terms of the asterisks or probability? No. Tell me what it means. What would be the interpretation? Ellie.
Like the level of extra education that these weathercasters have don't statistically significantly affect their trust or like which sources they do trust or don't.
Good. So if you couldn't hear what Ellie said, she said it exactly right, which is extra education, the training that these weathercasters get, doesn't have any impact on their trust among sources. Interesting. I can tell you that that was disheartening for the organizations themselves, because they felt like, you know, we're making these weathercasters jump through these hoops to get these seals of approval. At the time, there wasn't as much climate change information. Now there's a lot more that they put into these exams. So it's a series of exams and plus an on-air critique. So step 3, ideology. Step 3 means we're looking at the influence of ideology after we're looking at these others. And this is how I measured ideology in this survey, with one question. It was the second to last question in the survey, and it asked weathercasters to self-identify as extremely conservative, conservative, moderate, liberal, or very liberal, a 5-point scale. And it turned out they lined up just like most Americans. They weren't more conservative or more liberal than the American public. And it turned out, look at these arrows, right? I mean, these asterisks. Look at how the impact of ideology has on almost every source, right? I have to tell you that I've been doing this research on weathercasters, and now Jeremy's doing research on weathercasters, a very interesting study on how they use Twitter to communicate, which is going to be fascinating. So when I started this research, it never occurred to me to ask the question about ideology. It just didn't occur to me. These are science-trained professionals, right? So the conclusion really is that ideology was the primary and often only predictor of skepticism among this group of TV weathercasters. Most of it at the 99.9% level. So despite their training in science, many of them were allowing their personal ideology, political ideology, to taint their understanding of the science of climate change. So even though they have access to the public, and even though they're trusted by the public, some of them are not communicating the science effectively because of their own personal beliefs. I could tell you that when this research dropped, it was pretty shocking. It's the only time in my career that my research ended up in the New York Times. That was cool. It ended up on The Daily Show with Jon Stewart. It ended up on Nightline because it was pretty provocative, right? This idea that weathercasters were letting their personal beliefs impact their explanation of the science. And we're going to look at Colbert here in a minute because it was the best one. So the reason I did this research is because there was some high-profile skepticism by some TV weathercasters. Don't worry about John Coleman. You don't have to remember his name. He's now dead, too. But he was one of the founders of the Weather Channel, and he had a blog at the TV station in San Diego where he worked. And remember, weathercasters have this relationship with their audience. They're trusted. And he wrote a blog called Global Warming is the Greatest Scam in History. Wow. That's pretty provocative, right? When you think about all the scams that have gone on, right? And this is coming from a weathercaster who the audience can trust, right? So I asked weathercasters the same question. How do you feel about the statement global warming is a scam? This is called a Likert scale. Strongly agree, agree, neutral, disagree, strongly disagree. Interpret that for me. That's how the data turned out. So you're a journalist, you're on deadline, and you want to write something about that result. What would you say? There's a whole lot of things you could say, but Roberto.
There's a lot of uncertainty. There's more people that believe than don't believe that global warming is happening, but there's still uncertainty as to whether, because the most is neutral, which basically means like, I don't know.
Well, and I don't know is better, right? You can say, I need more information. So the good news is that almost half disagree or strongly disagree. But who the hell are these 26% who strongly agree or agree that it is a scam, right? That's what I wanted to answer, right? And that's what this particular study really got at, which is those who identified as conservative were more likely to be skeptical about the science. And the one chart we looked at was in trust in sources, but it showed up in other places too. So this is what he put in his blog, John Coleman. Global warming isn't something you believe in. I agree with that. What we've talked about all semester, right, as journalists, we're about facts. We're not operating on faith, beliefs. We're operating on facts, empirical evidence. That's good news. Global warming isn't something you believe in. It's science. It is. The science of meteorology. Wah, wah. It's not the science of meteorology. It's the science of climatology, right? So tell me the difference between climate and weather, because this ends up being such a key point of why there's so much miscommunication. Yeah.
Climate is your conditions in a certain area over a period of time.
Okay.
Weather is a much shorter period of time. Climate would be like your average weather patterns for like your year, and your weather would be for day or week.
Great. What's your name?
Nick.
Nick. So Nick tells us that climate is kind of an average. And in the United States, climate is an average over a 30-year period. So the average temperature today, the high is usually 81. That's our 30-year average. That's climate. Are we going to be 81 today? No, we're not, because of the weather that's happening, right? So Nick mentions another thing. So it's an average. The difference between climate and weather is also spatial, okay? So in an hour, we're going to have a huge downpour, it looks like. But maybe an hour to the south has the same climate, but maybe they're not going to get the shower. So climate and weather have a lot of overlap, but they're not the same thing. And being able to distinguish between the two ends up being really important.